Your parents are your problem, Claire. My money is mine. I am the provider here, and I cannot be bleeding capital for your family and their bad planning. My husband declared those words loudly across the patio for his entire family to hear. I just smiled softly, wiped my mouth, and agreed with him. I then pulled out my phone and stopped supporting his mother and sister with the $3,500 a month I had been secretly transferring them. Just 15 days later, his entire family was in an absolute panic. I am Claire, 33 years old, and a financial risk analyst at a top-tier hedge fund in Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to deal with a toxic family that takes advantage of your kindness. The air at my mother-in-law Brenda's lavish backyard barbecue was thick with the smell of expensive grilled meats and blooming hydrangeas. The sprawling suburban Chicago estate looked like a magazine cover. It was the perfect setting for a perfect family, or so they wanted everyone to believe. I had pulled my husband Brandon aside near the outdoor kitchen, hoping for a quiet and private conversation. My own parents, Thomas and Diane, were drowning in medical debt. My dad had recently undergone emergency surgery, and thanks to the endless loopholes in their insurance, they were hit with a bill they simply could not pay. I asked Brandon if we could temporarily divert some of our joint savings to help them stay afloat. Instead of keeping his voice down, Brandon stepped back so he was fully visible to his mother and his sister Stephanie. He slammed his cocktail glass down onto the granite counter, making the ice rattle loudly. Your parents are your problem, Claire. My money is mine. I am the provider here, and I cannot be bleeding capital for your family and their bad planning. The patio went dead silent for a split second before the ambient noise of clinking silverware resumed. Brenda, sitting under the shade of a massive patio umbrella, snickered. She adjusted her designer sunglasses and reached across the table, pushing a platter of premium Wagyu beef directly toward my brother-in-law, Kendrick. I had paid for that Wagyu beef with my own credit card just that morning, but Brenda acted as if Brandon had hunted it himself. Eat up, Kendrick. Brenda cooed, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. You need your strength for your big business ventures. We cannot let working-class problems ruin our Sunday afternoon. Kendrick flashed a wide, charismatic smile and speared a thick cut of the expensive meat. As an African-American entrepreneur who always dressed in flashy streetwear mixed with high-end designer labels, Kendrick was the loudest person in the family. He was currently pitching a new decentralized cryptocurrency platform that nobody really understood. Yo, Brandon is spitting facts right now, Kendrick said, pointing his fork at my husband. You have to protect the wealth, bro. I was just telling Stephanie last night that Brandon is the anchor of this family, a true boss. In fact, man, I still need that $50,000 seed round next month for my Web3 project. The market is shifting, and we have to scale fast before the institutional money grabs all the market share. We cannot be distracted by outside liabilities. Stephanie, sitting next to Kendrick, flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and nodded vigorously. She lived in a constant state of entitlement, acting like a high society housewife, despite having not worked a day in the past decade. Exactly, Claire, Stephanie chimed in. Brandon works so hard to keep this family at a certain standard. You cannot expect him to just hand over his hard-earned cash because your parents did not know how to invest properly. It is not our fault they are struggling. The audacity of the conversation was breathtaking. I stood there looking at these people who paraded around in luxury. I remembered the text message Brandon had sent me 3 years ago, right after we got married, gaslighting me into funneling my salary into our joint account, while claiming it was a temporary tax strategy to build our portfolio. He convinced me to set up an automatic transfer of $3,500 every single month labeled as a family support fund for Brenda and Stephanie. He told me it was an investment in our shared future, and that he was matching it with his brokerage firm profits. I looked at Brandon. He stood tall, chest puffed out, soaking in the admiration of his mother, sister, and brother-in-law. He truly believed he was the king of the castle, the wealthy provider who graciously allowed his blue-collar wife to sit at his table. He thought my silence was submission. He thought my calm demeanor was fear. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or defend my hardworking parents to people who would never understand the value of an honest dollar. Instead, I let a slow and serene smile spread across my face. I picked up a linen napkin, carefully wiped the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly on the counter. "You are absolutely right, Brandon," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Everyone should rely on their own money. Your money is yours. My money is mine. I completely agree with your philosophy." Brandon smirked, taking a sip of his drink, clearly satisfied that he had put me in my place so effortlessly in front of his audience. "Good to see you are finally understanding how the real world works, Claire," he replied. I turned on my heel and walked away from the outdoor kitchen, leaving the smell of Wagyu and their completely fake wealth far behind me as I headed straight toward my car. The heavy car door slammed shut, silencing the obnoxious laughter and clinking cocktail glasses echoing from Brenda's pristine backyard. I sank into the driver's seat, the hot leather burning against my back, yet a freezing, crystalline calm washed over my entire body. I did not shed a single tear. I did not hit the steering wheel in frustration. Instead, my hands were perfectly steady as I retrieved my phone from my handbag. Face recognition unlocked the screen in a fraction of a second, granting me immediate access to the joint banking application that dictated my marriage. Brandon loved to project the image of a titan, the wealthy provider, who graciously shielded his fragile working-class wife from the harsh realities of the financial world. He paraded around his family like a generous king, bestowing gifts upon his loyal subjects. But numbers, unlike my husband, do not possess the capacity to lie or manipulate. The digital dashboard loaded, displaying the primary checking and savings balances in bold green font. I tapped the screen to filter the transaction history over the past 8 months. The reality of our financial dynamics sat there in glaring, undeniable black and white. Exactly 90% of the capital flowing into this account originated from my direct deposits at the hedge fund, my bonuses, my base salary, my stock dividends. Brandon's boutique brokerage firm, the supposed financial anchor of this entire family, was a sinking ship. He was completely in the red. His deposits were sporadic and pathetic, barely sufficient to cover the exorbitant tabs he racked up at high-end steakhouses trying to impress clients he could never actually land. My income was paying the heavy mortgage on the sprawling house we lived in. My income covered the expensive leases for his luxury vehicles. My income funded the prestigious country club lifestyle his mother so desperately clung to. He was financially bleeding me to death to finance his patriarchal delusion. I opened my text messages and used the search function, typing in the word strategy. I scrolled back through 3 years of history, stopping at a conversation from the month right after our honeymoon. The messages loaded, preserving the exact moment he manipulated me. Brandon had written, "Baby, we need to consolidate our liquid capital immediately. My accountant advised that if we route your income through my primary joint account and establish a recurring monthly support transfer to my mother and Stephanie, we can categorize it as a family care deduction. It is just a temporary tax strategy to keep the government off our backs while I scale the firm. Trust me, I do wealth management for a living." I had trusted him completely. I had played the devoted partner who wanted to help her brilliant husband build an empire. I had personally logged in and established the automated transfer of $3,500 scheduled for the first of every month. I even let him label the transaction as the Brenda and Kendrick Support Fund. It was never a legitimate tax strategy. It was a parasitic pipeline designed to drain my resources, and I had willingly handed him the valve. He used my money to purchase their respect, taking absolute credit for my grueling 60-hour work weeks while simultaneously mocking my hardworking parents for their medical debt. My right thumb hovered over the glowing screen. As a senior financial risk analyst, my career was predicated on identifying toxic assets, isolating them, and neutralizing the threat before they could collapse a portfolio. Brandon and his entitled family were the most toxic assets I had ever acquired, and it was finally time to liquidate. I opened a new secure browser tab and logged into a private wealth management portal I had maintained since my early 20s. It took me exactly 4 minutes to open a brand new sole proprietor checking account that Brandon had absolutely no legal access to. My next step was accessing my corporate payroll portal. With 3 rapid clicks, I deleted our joint account routing information and replaced it with the fresh digits of my private account. My upcoming direct deposit, which included my substantial quarterly performance bonus, would now completely bypass Brandon forever. I switched back to the joint banking application and navigated to the Scheduled Transfers tab. There it sat, the $3,500 parasite primed to execute in exactly 2 days. I tapped the pending transaction on my screen. The banking system generated a warning prompt asking if I was certain I wanted to permanently delete this recurring payment. I pressed confirm without a fraction of hesitation. The transfer vanished into the digital void. The joint account balance, which historically swelled right before the first of the month thanks to my intense labor, would remain stagnant and hollow. Brandon was about to face the catastrophic reality of his own failing balance sheet. He would have to explain to his mother why the generous provider suddenly could not provide the luxury they demanded. Just as I locked my phone and placed it on the passenger seat, the screen illuminated with a new notification. A text message from Brandon had just arrived. I picked the device back up and read the bold words. "Do not forget to log in and pay the country club dues tomorrow morning. My mother has a massive luncheon scheduled with the board members, and her account needs to be in perfect standing." I stared at the arrogant demand. He was still standing on that patio sipping his expensive cocktail, utterly convinced that he had put me in my place, and that I would obediently continue to fund his family's luxurious facade. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. I did not argue. I did not complain. I simply typed a single calculated response. Handled right now. I hit send, shifted into drive, and pulled out of the long driveway. The countdown to their absolute financial destruction had officially begun, and I could not wait to watch them burn. The sterile scent of Chicago General Hospital was a sharp contrast to the blooming hydrangeas I had just left behind. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 412, finding my parents sitting in the dim light. My dad, Thomas, lay propped up against thin hospital pillows, looking pale and exhausted from his emergency surgery. My mother, Diane, sat beside him, clutching itemized hospital bills like a death sentence. "Claire, you should not have left Brandon's family barbecue to come here," my mother said. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "We do not want to cause any more friction between you two." My dad let out a dry cough. "He always makes us feel like we are begging for scraps, Claire. He once stood in our kitchen and told my brother that paying for my physical therapy was a bad return on investment. I do not want his money. I will go back to the warehouse next week. I can work overtime to pay this off." "You are not going back to the warehouse, Dad," I said, pulling up a chair next to his bed. "And you are not taking a dime of Brandon's money." I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out my tablet. The screen illuminated the dark room. I tapped the hospital billing portal icon and entered my father's patient ID number. The total outstanding balance glowed in red letters, showing exactly $12,450. Insurance had conveniently denied the surgical prep and the out-of-network anesthesiologist. I logged into my newly minted private checking account, the one holding my entire quarterly bonus and the redirected funds from my paycheck. I typed in the full amount of their medical debt and pressed submit. A green confirmation checkmark instantly replaced the red warning text. My mother gasped, looking over my shoulder at the screen. "Claire, what did you just do?" she asked, her voice trembling with genuine panic. "Brandon handles all the household wealth management. He is going to be absolutely furious when he sees that kind of capital missing from the joint ledger. You know how angry he gets when you make financial decisions without his explicit permission." I locked my tablet and placed it back into my bag. I reached out and squeezed my mother's shaking hands. "You do not need to worry about his temper ever again," I said, my voice projecting an absolute calm. "Brandon and I now have entirely separate finances." The sheer shock on their faces was priceless, but I did not have time to explain the impending implosion of my marriage. I kissed them both goodbye, told my dad to rest, and walked out of the hospital feeling lighter than I had in years. The next 48 hours passed in a state of quiet anticipation. I played the part of the perfect obedient wife. I cooked dinner. I smiled at Brandon's arrogant stories about his supposedly thriving brokerage firm, and I listened as he bragged on the phone to Kendrick about scaling their wealth. I knew his entire reality was resting on a digital foundation that I had just quietly demolished. Then, the morning of the first of the month finally arrived. I was sitting at my desk at the hedge fund surrounded by massive monitors displaying global market trends and risk assessment algorithms. My eyes were glued to my personal phone resting on the edge of my desk. At exactly 9 in the morning, the automated financial systems Brandon had set up began their scheduled sweeps. My phone screen lit up with the first push notification from our joint banking app. It was an overdraft alert. The autopay for his luxury-leased SUV had just attempted to pull $1,200 from an account holding exactly $12.50. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. 10 seconds later, a second notification flashed across the glass screen. Insufficient funds. The country club membership autopay had bounced. Brandon had explicitly told me to handle it, and I had. I handled it by ensuring there was absolutely zero capital available to fund his country club vanity project. Then came the heavy hitters. The banking system attempted to execute the recurring monthly transfer of $3,500 to the account shared by Brenda and Stephanie. The screen lit up with a bright red warning banner: transfer denied due to lack of available funds. Account routing error. A rush of pure adrenaline coursed through my veins. As a risk analyst, I spent my life calculating the exact moment a toxic asset would collapse. Watching Brandon's artificial empire crash in real time was the most satisfying return on investment I had ever witnessed. I knew Brandon would not notice immediately. He rarely woke up before 10, and he never checked the daily ledgers because he relied entirely on my labor to keep his accounts solvent. But the parasites feeding off my income would notice instantly. Right on cue, my phone began to vibrate across the polished wood of my desk. The caller ID flashed a picture of my mother-in-law, Brenda. I did not answer. I simply flipped the phone face down and continued reviewing my morning financial reports, letting the device rattle against the desk until it finally stopped. A minute later, the voicemail icon appeared. I put in my wireless earbud and tapped play. Brenda's voice came through the speaker, shrill and dripping with absolute outrage. "Claire, what is going on with the accounts?" she demanded. "I just tried to pay for my hot stone massage and my card declined in front of everyone. The receptionist actually looked at me like I was some kind of street beggar. Did you forget to do the bank transfers again? This is completely unacceptable and frankly embarrassing for our family. Fix this immediately." I pulled the earbud out, tossed it onto my desk, and smiled at my large monitors. The polished marble floors of the Apex Capital hedge fund lobby were not designed for screeching. They were designed to absorb the quiet, confident footsteps of top-tier financial analysts. So when the elevator doors chimed and my mother-in-law Brenda came storming through the security gates, her voice pierced the hushed atmosphere like a siren. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room finalizing a quarterly risk assessment matrix on my dual monitors. Through the glass, I watched Brenda shove her way past the bewildered front desk concierge. She was wearing a tennis skirt that cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage payment and clutching her designer handbag like a weapon. Her face was flushed an angry, blotchy red that clashed violently with her heavy gold jewelry. "Claire, get out here right now!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the glass. I did not jump. I did not scramble to appease her. I took a slow, deliberate breath, saved my financial models, and calmly pushed my chair back. I stepped out of the conference room into the lobby, my heels clicking softly against the marble. Several of my colleagues paused their conversations to stare at the spectacle. Brenda did not care about the audience. She only cared about her bruised ego. "Do you have any idea what you just did to me?" Brenda demanded, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. I was at the Oakwood Country Club. I hosted the charity committee luncheon. 8 of the most influential women in Chicago were sitting at my table. When the waiter brought the $800 bill, I handed him my platinum card, just like I do every single month. And do you know what happened, Claire? Do you know what that waiter said to me in front of everyone? I stood perfectly still, keeping my facial expression entirely neutral. Please, Brenda, enlighten me. He told me the card was declined. Brenda spat out the word as if it was a disease. Declined. I had to sit there while Margaret Wellington paid for my lunch. Do you have any concept of how humiliating that is? I had to pretend my bank flagged it for fraud. I had to laugh it off while dying inside, all because you forgot to do your basic duties and transfer the funds. Her entitlement was staggering. For 3 years, I had silently funded her lavish lifestyle, paying her country club dues, her spa days, and her expensive lunches. She never once thanked me. She just expected my hard-earned salary to magically appear in her account, ready to be squandered on maintaining her high society facade. I am not sure how your lunch bill is my responsibility, Brenda, I said, my voice low and steady. Because you manage the transfers, you stupid girl, Brenda snapped, stepping closer. You are supposed to make sure the family support fund is fully stocked by the first of the month. That is your job. Brandon provides the lifestyle, and you handle the administrative busywork. But I guess a cheap working-class girl like you just cannot comprehend the social requirements of actual wealth. You probably think $800 is a fortune. You have absolutely no class and no respect for this family. The classist insult hung in the air. For years, those kinds of comments had stung. They had made me work harder, try harder, pay more, just to prove I was worthy of the prestigious Brandon name. But standing in my high-powered office surrounded by the actual wealth I managed daily, her words just sounded pathetic. I calmly looked up from my tablet and met her furious gaze. I did not forget anything, Brenda. The transfers were canceled. Brenda froze, her mouth falling slightly open. Canceled. What do you mean canceled? You do not have the authority to cancel family funds. I folded my arms. Actually, I have absolute authority over my own paycheck. You see, Brandon and I had a very illuminating conversation at your barbecue 5 days ago. He explicitly stated that his money is his and my money is mine. He made it perfectly clear in front of you and Stephanie that he is the sole provider and the anchor of this family. I took his brilliant financial philosophy to heart. I separated our accounts. So if you need $800 for a country club luncheon, you will have to ask your wealthy, successful son for your allowance. Brenda let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. You are lying. Brandon would never allow this. You are just being a petty, vindictive little brat because he put you in your place about your parents' medical bills. You think you can hold my money hostage to get back at him. I am calling him right now, and he is going to force you to fix this mess. She snatched her phone from her designer bag, her fingers trembling with rage as she dialed Brandon's number. She hit the speakerphone button and held the device up like a trophy, fully expecting her son to rain down hellfire on my insubordination. The phone rang twice before Brandon answered. Mom, I am in the middle of a client pitch. What is it? Brandon sounded agitated. Brandon, your wife has completely lost her mind. Brenda practically yelled into the microphone. I am standing in her office lobby right now. My card declined at the country club in front of the entire charity committee. She is claiming that she canceled the monthly support transfers and separated the accounts. Tell her to wire the funds into my account this exact second or there will be hell to pay. There was a long, agonizing silence on the line. The aggressive provider facade vanished. Mom, just calm down. Brandon stammered, his voice trembling with sudden panic. It is not Claire. It is a bank glitch. A massive routing error. Do not yell at her. I will fix it today, Mom. 5 days after Brenda's humiliating exit from my office lobby, the carefully constructed facade of my husband's family began to visibly crack under the pressure of their sudden financial drought. It was day 10 of the month, and the reality of a $0 cash flow was sending shockwaves through their lavish routines. I was working from the kitchen island of the sprawling suburban house my income had exclusively paid for over the last 3 years. My laptop was open to a series of predictive modeling charts, but my attention was sharply diverted by the aggressive roar of an engine echoing up the driveway. I glanced through the bay window to see a pristine white luxury vehicle violently pull up, stopping inches from my manicured flower beds. The driver's side door swung open, and Kendrick stepped out. He was dressed in his typical entrepreneurial uniform, consisting of a $1,000 designer tracksuit, heavy gold chains, and limited edition sneakers that had never touched actual dirt. He slammed the heavy car door and marched toward the front porch with a furious entitlement that perfectly mirrored his mother, Brenda. He did not bother to ring the doorbell. He pounded a heavy fist against the solid oak wood, making the glass panes rattle in their frames. I closed my laptop, picked up my coffee mug, and walked slowly to the entryway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, revealing Kendrick's panicked face. "Yo, Claire, what is going on with the accounts?" Kendrick demanded, skipping any pretense of a polite greeting. He paced frantically across the porch, throwing his hands in the air. "Brandon said the transfer bounced because of some massive bank glitch, but it has been 10 days. 10 days, Claire. I got server space to rent. I got developers in Eastern Europe waiting on their crypto deposits. My Web3 project is completely stalling. You need to log in and force the wire through manually right now. We cannot let institutional capital dry up while we are in the middle of a crucial scaling phase. You are killing my momentum." He was sweating despite the cool morning air. The buzzwords poured out of his mouth in a chaotic stream of absolute nonsense. He genuinely believed his own hype. He thought he was a visionary founder navigating a temporary cash flow crisis, rather than an immature man throwing a temper tantrum because his allowance was late. I leaned against the doorframe, taking a slow sip of my hot coffee. I let him ramble for another full minute, watching him gesture wildly about blockchain integration and decentralized finance networks. He sounded exactly like a business podcast he had listened to at double speed without comprehending a single underlying economic principle. "Are you quite finished, Kendrick?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. He stopped pacing and glared at me. "No, I am not finished. You are the one handling the administrative side of Brandon's wealth. He told me to come here and have you push the funds through. We need that $3,500 today. Stephanie is stressing out, and I cannot have bad vibes in my creative workspace. Fix the glitch, Claire." I smiled, a slow and deliberate smile that made Kendrick take a sudden step back. "There is no bank glitch, Kendrick," I stated clearly, letting the words sink into the quiet morning air. "The transfer did not bounce due to a routing error. I permanently canceled the automated family support fund. There is no money coming to you today, tomorrow, or ever again." His eyes widened in absolute shock. He stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "Brandon matched that fund. It is our seed capital." "Brandon has not matched a single penny in over 8 months, I replied, dismantling his delusion with surgical precision. "Brandon is completely broke. His boutique brokerage firm is a massive failure. The only reason you and Stephanie have been able to sustain your pathetic illusion of high society wealth is because of my direct deposits. Your Web3 project. You mean the decentralized app you have supposedly been building for 3 years while I paid your mortgage? You mean the brilliant tech startup that has exactly 0 active users, 0 market validation, and 0 viable product?" I stepped out onto the porch, closing the distance between us. "You lease an expensive vehicle, you buy imported streetwear, and you claim to be a hustler. But you are not a hustler, Kendrick. You are a dependent. You have been living off a working-class girl from Chicago while actively mocking my family for their financial struggles. I funded your entire reality, and I just pulled the plug." Kendrick's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. The polished entrepreneur persona completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, panicked man who suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a financial cliff. "You cannot do this," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are just his wife. You do not have the right to cut us off. Brandon is the head of this family. I am calling him right now and telling him you are hoarding assets. I will tell him you are hiding money and actively sabotaging his investments. You are going to ruin your own marriage just to be petty." I looked at his trembling hand and then looked directly into his panicked eyes. "Tell him whatever you want, Kendrick," I whispered, my tone dripping with absolute finality. "Tell him I am hoarding the money I earned. Tell him the bank glitch is actually his wife, finally opening her eyes. But while you are making that phone call, you might want to ask him how you're going to pay your car lease next week." I stepped back inside, grabbing the heavy oak door. "Good luck with your seed round, Kendrick." I slammed the wooden door tightly shut. 2 days after I slammed the front door on Kendrick and his aggressive entrepreneurial entitlement, the silence in my house was abruptly broken. It was Tuesday afternoon, and the autumn sun was casting long shadows across my home office floor. I was deep into a complex derivative pricing model for the hedge fund when my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the glass surface of my desk. The screen illuminated, displaying a picture of my sister-in-law, Stephanie. She had never once called me during business hours in the 3 years I had been married to her brother. Her preferred method of communication was usually a demanding text message, ordering me to pick up expensive dry cleaning or drop off catering for her social events. I let the phone vibrate for 10 seconds before I finally tapped the green accept button and put it on speakerphone. I did not say a word. I simply waited for her to speak. "Oh my God, Claire, thank goodness you picked up," Stephanie wailed. Her voice was thick with manufactured panic and the unmistakable sound of forced tears. "I have been trying to reach Brandon all morning, but his assistant keeps sending me directly to his voicemail. He told me there was some kind of massive glitch with the family accounts and that his capital is temporarily tied up in a liquidity audit. Claire, I am absolutely desperate right now." I kept my eyes on my dual monitors, continuing to review my financial models. "What exactly is the emergency, Stephanie?" I asked, my tone completely devoid of empathy. "It is Chloe's tuition," Stephanie cried, her voice trembling with theatrical distress. "The headmaster at her private academy just sent me a final notice. If I do not pay the $4,000 monthly installment by tomorrow afternoon, they are going to unenroll her. You know how sensitive Chloe is. She will be absolutely devastated if she loses her friends and her placement in the advanced ballet program. Brandon always takes care of this for us, but with his funds locked up, I have nowhere else to turn. You have to help me, Claire. I know you have that big corporate salary. You can just wire the money directly to the school portal and Brandon will pay you back the second his account's clear. Please do it for your niece." It was a masterful performance. Stephanie had always been the designated victim of the family, utilizing her status as a single mother to extract maximum financial sympathy from Brandon and their mother. She weaponized her daughter to secure a luxurious lifestyle she absolutely refused to work for. But unlike Brandon, I did not suffer from a hero complex. I did not need to buy her affection. I opened a new tab on my browser. Before I had completely severed the financial pipeline, I had possessed full administrative access to the primary family credit line. I had removed my name and my income from the account, but my login credentials for the digital banking dashboard were still active for another week. I typed in my password and navigated to the recent transaction ledger for the card issued in Stephanie's name. "That is a terrifying situation, Stephanie," I said, my fingers gliding across the keyboard. "It must be incredibly stressful to face the prospect of your daughter being pulled out of her prestigious school. I completely understand why you are in such a panic today." "It is a total nightmare," Stephanie sniffled, sensing that her manipulation was working. "I literally have not slept in 2 days worrying about this, so you will wire the funds right. You have the school portal login from last year." I scrolled down the digital ledger, the screen populated with a long list of exorbitant purchases. I paused at a pending transaction dated exactly 48 hours ago. "I am looking at a very interesting data point right now, Stephanie," I said, leaning back in my ergonomic desk chair. "You claim you have not slept in 2 days because you are paralyzed by financial anxiety regarding Chloe's education. Yet the ledger for your Platinum card shows a cleared transaction from Sunday afternoon. You authorized a payment of exactly $5,200 to a boutique designer retailer in Milan. The tracking number indicates that a limited edition lambskin handbag is currently out for delivery to your luxury townhouse." The fake crying on the other end of the line stopped instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence filled my home office. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Stephanie's head as her victim persona violently collided with empirical evidence. You bought a $5,000 purse while your daughter's school tuition was past due, I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You expect me to liquidate my personal assets to fund your parental responsibilities while you prioritize Italian leather. You are not a desperate mother, Stephanie. You are a financial parasite. I am not giving you a single dime. You can sell the handbag to pay the headmaster. The silence shattered. Stephanie's voice erupted from the speakerphone, stripped of all the previous vulnerability and dripping with absolute venom. You miserable, cheap, working-class witch! She screamed, her voice echoing off the walls of my office. How dare you hack into my personal transaction history? You have absolutely no right to monitor my spending. You are just a temporary fixture in this family, Claire. Brandon only married you because you were a convenient little workhorse who would blindly follow his orders. I reached for my coffee mug, completely unfazed by her tantrum. Is that right, Stephanie? You think you are so smart hoarding your little paycheck? She shrieked, her breathing ragged and heavy. Brandon is going to divorce you immediately and take half of every single thing you own anyway. I pressed the red button on my phone, hanging up the call to enjoy the absolute silence remaining around me. The silence after my termination of Stephanie's call lasted exactly 3 days. Day 15 arrived with a violent crash that shook the foundation of our suburban home. I was measuring espresso beans for coffee. The tranquility shattered when the front door was kicked open with such force that the doorknob gouged a dent into the drywall. Heavy footsteps pounded across the floors. Claire. Brandon's voice was a roar echoing down the hallway. He did not sound like the polished brokerage founder who glided through these rooms. He sounded like a cornered animal. I did not flinch. I pressed the brew button and turned around as he stormed into the kitchen. His appearance was shocking. His suit jacket was missing, his tie was undone, and his hair was a sweaty mess. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes wild and bloodshot from whatever financial nightmare he had endured. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, closing the distance until he was uncomfortably close. He slammed his briefcase onto the marble countertop so hard that my coffee mug rattled. You emptied the joint account, Brandon screamed, leaning over the island. His breath smelled of stale scotch and raw panic. I spent 2 hours sitting in a humiliating seminar with the managing partners at the commercial bank. My business accounts are frozen, Claire. Frozen. They rejected a bridge loan application because of massive unpaid debts and negative cash flow. I tried to transfer funds from our joint account to cover the margin calls, and the teller told me the balance was $0. $0. Where is my money? I maintained steady eye contact, refusing to shrink away from his aggressive posturing. I took a slow breath, letting the aroma of the brewing espresso ground my senses. I reached into the manila folder sitting neatly on the corner of the island. I had anticipated this exact confrontation. I had prepared the documentation hours ago, knowing he would come searching for a scapegoat. I pulled out a printed bank statement and slid it across the marble surface, stopping it in front of his clenched fists. Your money, Brandon? I asked, my voice quiet but laced with lethal precision. I suggest you take a very close look at that ledger before you accuse me of any theft. Brandon snatched the paper, holding it up with trembling hands. His eyes darted frantically across the numerous columns of black numbers. He was looking for a massive, sudden withdrawal, a malicious transfer, a smoking gun he could use to justify his rage. Instead, he found the cold, hard, empirical truth of our entire marriage. I highlighted the specific column for your convenience. I continued, folding my arms firmly across my chest. That document represents the transactional history of our primary joint account over the last 6 months. It clearly outlines every single deposit and every single withdrawal made by either of us. Read the deposit column, Brandon. Read the total amount of capital you have personally contributed to this household since January. He stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing as his brain violently struggled to process the irrefutable numbers. The righteous indignation began to drain rapidly from his flushed face, replaced by a sickening realization. You have deposited exactly $12 in the last 6 months, Brandon. I stated, clearly enunciating every single syllable. $12. That was a Venmo reimbursement for a streaming service subscription you accidentally charged to my corporate card. That is the sum total of your financial contribution to this marriage. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every grocery run, every single dollar that funded your mother's country club dues and your sister's luxury shopping habits came directly from my paycheck. You have not been providing for anyone. You have been drowning in massive debt while parading around Chicago pretending to be a master of the universe. Brandon's hands dropped limply to his sides, the printed bank statement fluttering down to the marble countertop. For a brief second, he looked entirely broken. The grand illusion he had spent years meticulously maintaining had just been dismantled by basic arithmetic. But the vulnerability was incredibly fleeting. The shame quickly metastasized into something much darker and far more dangerous. He stepped around this kitchen island, aggressively invading my personal space. The air between us grew thick and suffocating. He loomed over me, using his physical size to attempt the intimidation his bank account could no longer achieve. A cruel, malicious sneer slowly twisted his features, completely erasing the handsome, charming man I mistakenly thought I had married. "You think you are so brilliant, Claire," he whispered, his voice dropping to a menacing, gravelly pitch. "You think you can just turn off the tap and sit back to watch me drown? You think hoarding your corporate salary makes you untouchable?" I held my ground, refusing to break eye contact or take a single step back. "I am simply keeping what I rightfully earned, Brandon. You explicitly stated that your money is yours and mine is mine. I am just honoring your strict financial philosophy." His sneer widened into a vicious, predatory grin. He leaned in so close I could feel the intense heat radiating off his skin. "We do not have a prenup, Claire," he hissed, the harsh words sliding out like pure venom. "You were just a sweet, naive girl from a working-class family, and I was the wealthy heir apparent. Nobody thought you had anything worth protecting, but you have been hoarding massive bonuses and lucrative stock options for 3 years while silently paying down the principal on this massive house. You think you are smart pulling this little stunt. But by law, half of whatever you are hoarding is legally mine. Half of your savings, half of your investments, half of the total equity in this property. I am going to divorce you. I am going to take half of everything you own, and I will completely ruin you." Brandon's threat hung in the air like toxic smoke. He did not storm out. He simply pulled his phone from his pocket, his vicious grin settling into a mask of cold calculation, and fired off a single text message. I remained perfectly still, watching him retreat to the far end of the house. I spent the next 4 hours sitting at the kitchen island, transferring liquid assets from my personal accounts into a secure offshore trust. I had anticipated his legal threats long before he ever verbalized them. By 8 o'clock, the house was draped in heavy shadows. I moved to the living room, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water when the front door chimed open. I expected Brandon to emerge from his study. Instead, the heavy thud of multiple footsteps echoed through the foyer. Brandon marched into the living room, but he was not alone. He had orchestrated a full family ambush. Brenda stormed in right behind him, followed closely by a scowling Stephanie and a deeply agitated Kendrick. They fanned out across my living room, positioning themselves to block the exits. They were trying to physically intimidate me. I remained seated on the velvet sofa, taking a slow sip of water. I did not offer them a seat. I simply watched the pathetic theatrical production unfold. Brenda took the center stage, her face twisted into a mask of profound suffering. She clutched a lace handkerchief, pressing it against her dry eyes. "You are a traitorous wife," Claire Brenda began, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I have never in my entire life witnessed such a malicious, calculated destruction of a proud family. We opened our arms to you. We gave you the prestigious Brandon name. We elevated you to a social circle you could never have dreamed of accessing on your own. And this is how you repay us, by betraying your husband and trying to ruin us out of pure, unadulterated spite." I placed my glass on the coffee table. "You opened your wallets to me, Brenda, and you found them completely empty, so you decided to use mine instead." "Do not interrupt me!" Brenda shrieked, dropping the grieving mother act entirely. Her face flushed a violent red. "You have no respect for the natural order of a marriage. Brandon is the head of this household. He is the financial visionary. You are supposed to support his endeavors, not sabotage his capital when he hits a temporary market fluctuation. But I always knew you would do something like this. I told Brandon the day he proposed that marrying you was a catastrophic mistake. Brenda took a step closer, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice dropped, vibrating with suppressed elitist rage. I always hated your parents, Claire. Those pathetic blue-collar nobodies with their cheap clothes and their small-minded working-class mentality. When we had to sit across from them at the rehearsal dinner, I practically gagged. They smelled like cheap detergent and desperation. I knew you carried that same cheap, greedy desperation inside you. You have no class, no pedigree, and absolutely no understanding of how wealth operates. You are nothing but a glorified secretary who got lucky with a corporate promotion. You owe your entire lifestyle to my son. You must submit to your husband's financial authority immediately, or we will make sure you are cast out of this city without a single penny to your name." Stephanie scoffed loudly from the corner of the room, folding her arms. She is right, Claire. You are completely destroying Chloe's future just because you want to hoard cash like a paranoid peasant. You are tearing this family apart. Kendrick nodded aggressively, pacing near the hallway. You are killing our generational wealth. My developers dropped my Web3 project today because the wire never arrived. You owe me that seed capital. You signed a marital contract, which means your income belongs to the family trust. You cannot just arbitrarily decide to starve our investments. I looked at the four of them, a collective hive of parasites desperately trying to protect their host. They were not a family. They were a financial syndicate built on a foundation of absolute lies, and they were panicking because their only revenue stream had permanently dried up. "Are you all quite finished?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly in the large room. "Because this intervention is incredibly boring. You came into my house drinking my water, breathing my air to demand that I continue funding your delusions. Brandon has $12 to his name. The Brandon family legacy is a mountain of high-interest debt and maxed-out credit cards. You are not royalty, Brenda. You are broke." Brandon stepped forward, moving past his mother. The vicious smirk had returned to his face. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, dropping them onto the glass coffee table with a heavy, definitive thud. "You talk too much." Claire, Brandon sneered, stepping uncomfortably close to the sofa. He leaned over, placing both hands on the armrests, trapping me in my seat. His cologne mixed with the sharp scent of his desperation. "You think you hold the cards because you changed the passwords to your little bank accounts. But you forgot one crucial detail. You are my wife. We share liabilities and we share assets. You are legally bound to me." He tapped a heavy finger against the top page of the thick document. "This is a legally drafted ironclad power of attorney. It grants me absolute unrestricted control over every single financial asset, investment portfolio, and real estate holding in your name. It gives me the legal authority to liquidate your offshore accounts and restructure your corporate stock options to cover my margin calls. You are going to sign it right now," Brandon whispered, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "You are going to sign over power of attorney to me tonight. If you refuse, I will drag you through a divorce so brutal and so expensive that you will be begging to return to your parents' cheap little house. You have exactly 1 minute to pick up that pen." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Brandon stood over me, his chest heaving, fully expecting my absolute submission. Brenda wore a triumphant, malicious smirk, while Stephanie and Kendrick watched like starving scavengers waiting for a feast. I did not reach for the pen. I did not cower. Instead, I slowly picked up the thick stack of legal documents. The paper felt heavy, premium quality, undoubtedly billed to a credit card he could not even afford to pay off. I looked at Brandon, maintaining a completely vacant expression. He smiled, assuming my silence was surrender. I gripped the top edge of the power of attorney and pulled my hands in opposite directions. The sharp, violent sound of tearing paper echoed like a gunshot through the quiet living room. Brandon flinched. Brenda gasped, taking a sudden step backward, her heavy gold jewelry clanking against her chest. I stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again, methodically reducing his ironclad legal threat into worthless confetti. I let the shredded pieces flutter down onto the pristine glass coffee table, completely covering his reflection. "Are you out of your absolute mind?" Brandon roared, his voice cracking with disbelief and raw, unfiltered fury. He lunged forward, his hands gripping the edge of the coffee table so hard his knuckles turned white. "You cannot just destroy a legally binding document, Claire. I am your husband. By the laws of this state, I am entitled to 50% of all marital assets. I own half of this house. I own half of the sweat equity. You cannot lock me out of my own property. I will take you to court and bleed you dry." Brenda eagerly joined his assault, stepping up beside him with renewed viciousness. "You are going to be living in a cardboard box by the time my son is finished with you," she shrieked, pointing a manicured claw directly at my face. "He is going to force the immediate sale of this entire estate. He will take half the proceeds and leave you with nothing. We will make sure you are blacklisted from every prestigious neighborhood in Chicago. You will be back in the slums with your pathetic parents before the week is over." I remained perfectly seated on the velvet sofa, entirely untouched by their hysterical screaming. Their threats were incredibly hollow, based on a fundamental, arrogant misunderstanding of who actually held the power. I slowly leaned forward and reached underneath the coffee table, retrieving the heavy leather portfolio I had brought out of my home office earlier. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a single thick document bearing a golden notary seal. I did not hand it to Brandon. I placed it carefully on the glass surface, right next to the shredded remains of his pathetic power of attorney. "You are deeply mistaken about the legal reality of your situation, Brandon," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the room with absolute chilling clarity. "You do not own half of this house. In fact, you do not own a single brick." Brandon stared at the document, his breathing shallow and rapid. "What kind of trick is this?" he demanded, refusing to look directly at the paper. "It is not a trick," I replied, tracing the embossed gold seal with my index finger. "It is the official property deed. When we got married, you refused to sign a prenuptial agreement because you explicitly told me you wanted to protect your massive family wealth from a working-class girl like me. I simply took your brilliant financial advice to heart and aggressively protected my own assets." I stood up, finally, using my physical space to force him to look up at me. "While your mother was busy holding her nose at my parents' cheap clothes and their blue-collar jobs, she completely ignored the fact that my maternal grandmother was an incredibly frugal woman who quietly amassed a substantial fortune over 60 years. Before she passed away, she placed her entire life savings into a private trust for my exclusive use. I used that exact trust to establish an anonymous, limited liability company 3 months before our wedding day." The blood began to drain rapidly from Brandon's face, leaving his skin looking pale and sickly against his unbuttoned collar. "That LLC purchased this property entirely in cash." I continued, delivering the fatal blow with surgical precision. "My name is not on the deed. Your name is absolutely nowhere near the deed. The house belongs to a corporate entity that I entirely control. You have never paid the mortgage because there is no mortgage. You have never paid the property taxes because my accountant handles them annually. You are not a homeowner, Brandon. Legally speaking, you are just a tenant, and your lease has officially expired." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the deafening sound of an entire generational dynasty completely collapsing under the crushing weight of its own unearned arrogance. The grand illusion was dead. Brenda pressed her lace handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She looked at the torn pieces of the power of attorney and then at the golden seal of the property deed. The devastating realization that she had been ruthlessly insulting the sole owner of her son's entire lifestyle finally registered in her highly curated brain. She slowly backed away from the coffee table, her knees visibly shaking beneath her expensive designer skirt. Stephanie looked like she was going to be physically ill. She grabbed the edge of an upholstered side chair to steady herself, her chest heaving. The crushing reality that her brother could not bail her out of her massive credit card debt or pay her daughter's private school tuition was violently crashing down on her. The endless financial safety net she had maliciously exploited for years was permanently gone. But the most profound and dangerous reaction came from Kendrick. He was standing near the hallway archway, perfectly still. He looked at Brandon, taking in the cheap, sweaty reality of a desperate man who possessed exactly $12 in his checking account. Then he slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The $1,000 streetwear suddenly looked incredibly ridiculous on his frame. Kendrick had married into the prestigious Brandon family, believing he was securing a golden ticket to elite society. He had tolerated Stephanie's endless demands and funded his fake Web3 lifestyle on the assumption that a massive family trust fund would eventually cover his mounting debts. He had played the role of the visionary founder because he thought he was backed by limitless generational wealth. "You own nothing," Kendrick whispered, his voice entirely devoid of his usual aggressive bravado. The realization hit him like a physical strike. He stared at Stephanie, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, calculating rage. He realized the rich family he married into actually owned absolutely nothing. He had attached his entire financial future to a sinking ship, and the captain was completely broke. Kendrick glared at Stephanie, his face hardening with a vicious, unspoken threat. The living room descended into absolute chaos. Brenda collapsed onto the velvet sofa, weeping hysterically about social ruin. Brandon stood frozen, his eyes locked on the shredded power of attorney and the property deed. He looked like a man who had watched his empire burn to ashes. Stephanie began screaming at her mother, demanding to know how they could be broke. I ignored their pathetic theatrics. I picked up my glass, smoothed my trousers, and walked out of the room. I retreated to the kitchen, leaving the sounds of their civil war echoing down the hallway. I placed my glass on the marble counter. The silence was incredibly brief. Heavy footsteps approached the kitchen entrance. Kendrick slipped through the doorway, his eyes darting back toward the hallway to ensure no one had followed him. He closed the heavy oak door with a soft click, isolating us from the screaming matches erupting in the foyer. He no longer looked like the aggressive predator from earlier. He wore the slick, manufactured smile of a desperate salesman. He took a step forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Claire," he whispered, keeping his voice carefully pitched. "Let us take a breath and talk about this like rational adults. You and I are the only smart people in this house. Everyone else out there is completely delusional." I crossed my arms against the kitchen island. "I am not interested in having a rational discussion with a parasite, Kendrick. You can leave through the back door." He chuckled nervously, taking another step closer. "Look, I get it. You played a brilliant hand. You totally exposed Brandon and his ridiculous family. I respect that. But you have a massive target on your back now. Brandon is desperate, and desperate men do dangerous things. He is not going to just walk away. He will drag you through the mud, freeze your assets, and tie you up in litigation for a decade. You need an ally on the inside who knows his plans." I maintained a perfectly blank expression. "And you are volunteering for this noble position?" Kendrick nodded, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. "Absolutely. I have been watching Brandon for 2 years. I know exactly how he operates. I know about the offshore accounts he hid from the IRS and the illegal wire transfers he authorized to cover his margin calls. I have access to his private ledger and digital correspondence. I can give you the exact ammunition you need to lock him up and walk away untouched. I will hand you the smoking gun on a silver platter." I tilted my head, studying his sweaty forehead. "And what exactly is the price for this silver platter, Kendrick? Because I know you do not do anything out of the goodness of your heart." His slick smile widened. $50,000. That is it. A drop in the bucket for a woman who buys a multi-million-dollar estate in cash. I need 50 grand to finalize the smart contracts for my Web3 platform. You wire me the seed capital by tomorrow morning, and I will hand over every single piece of dirt I have on your husband. We help each other and we both win." I let out a slow, deliberate laugh. The sound was entirely devoid of warmth. It echoed sharply against the marble countertops. Kendrick frowned, his smile faltering, as my amusement violently collided with his expectations. "You want me to fund your pathetic crypto startup in exchange for information I already possess? I asked, pushing away from the island. I stood tall, closing the distance between us. I pulled a sleek silver flash drive from my blazer pocket and dropped it onto the counter. It landed with a sharp metallic clack. I do not need your amateur espionage, Kendrick. I already cloned Brandon's hard drive 3 weeks ago. I have every wire transfer, deleted email, and fraudulent loan application categorized and ready for my attorneys. Your leverage is entirely worthless. Kendrick's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He stared at the flash drive, his jaw tightening as his grand strategy crumbled into dust. You are making a massive mistake, Claire. You do not understand the kind of connections I have. I understand exactly who you are, Kendrick, I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper. I know exactly how you operate. You think nobody looks at the blockchain ledgers. You think you can spin up a digital token, hype it to gullible investors, and cash out before the structure collapses. I read your white paper. I tracked the wallet addresses associated with your so-called developers. There is no development team. There is no smart contract infrastructure. Your entire Web3 project is a textbook Ponzi scheme. He stepped back, his eyes widening in pure unadulterated panic. Shut your mouth. You do not know what you are talking about. I know that you took $200,000 from independent investors and immediately funneled it into a private wallet to pay off your sports gambling debts. I continued, driving the knife deeper with every single word. You are not a tech visionary. You are a common thief running a digital scam. You came in here demanding my money because your initial investors are demanding an audit and you need fresh capital to pay them off before they report you directly to the SEC. Kendrick's face contorted into a mask of absolute hatred. The slick facade vanished, completely replaced by a violent, cornered desperation. His hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He took a heavy step toward me, his eyes burning with a dangerous, feral intensity. You think you are untouchable, Claire? He hissed, his voice vibrating with malicious fury. You have just made the biggest mistake of your life. He spun around and stormed toward the kitchen door, tearing it open. The parasite had found his host again. He was aligning fully with Brandon to completely destroy me. Kendrick tore out of the kitchen, his heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway to join the rest of the parasites plotting in the foyer. I did not waste a single second celebrating his humiliated exit. My survival instincts were already calculating their next collective move. Desperate people who have been stripped of their grand illusions do not simply pack their bags and surrender. They escalate. They scorch the earth. I locked the heavy kitchen door, engaged the deadbolt, and pivoted toward the east wing where my home office was located. I had secured my financial assets digitally, but I needed to ensure my physical workspace remained completely untainted. I unlocked the solid mahogany door to my office and stepped inside, reaching for the brass desk lamp. The warm light flooded the room, illuminating my dual monitors and the sleek silver frame of my personal laptop. I stopped halfway across the Persian rug. The air in the room felt disturbed. My heart executed a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I am a woman who thrives on immaculate precision. I possess an eidetic memory for physical spaces. When I had left this room hours earlier to brew espresso, my wireless mouse was perfectly parallel to the edge of my ergonomic keyboard. Now it rested at a slight, careless angle. The charging cable for my laptop, which I always loop twice around the base of the monitor stand, was uncoiled. Someone had been inside my sanctuary. Brandon and his family had been screaming in the living room, meaning this breach occurred either right before the ambush or during the chaos, while I was distracted by Kendrick's pathetic extortion attempt. I crossed the room and placed my hand on the smooth casing of my laptop. The battery chassis was perceptibly warm. The machine had been running high-performance tasks while the screen was asleep. I opened the lid, bypassing the biometric lock, and immediately launched the terminal. I dug straight into the command line, pulling up the active process directory and the recent administrative logs. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a deep system diagnostic. Line after line of code populated the black screen. I froze. A hidden executable file was running silently in the background, buried under a spoofed system registry name. It was a sophisticated military-grade keylogger. It was designed to silently record every keystroke capture screen imagery and transmit encrypted data packets to an external server. Brandon had no technical skills of his own, but his country club circle was crawling with unethical cybersecurity contractors and disgraced tech founders who would happily install spyware for a favor. He had leveraged a connection to infiltrate my machine. He was hunting for the new passwords to my offshore accounts. But as I traced the export logs to see exactly what the keylogger had captured, a cold, suffocating dread pooled in the pit of my stomach. He had not just captured my banking credentials. The export log showed a massive data transfer originating from a highly restricted, encrypted partition on my hard drive. I had accessed that specific partition earlier this morning to review quarterly projections for my firm. The file he had extracted was not personal. It was the master VIP client roster for the hedge fund. It contained the names, private contact information, and aggressive investment positions of our most heavily guarded institutional investors and high net worth individuals. It included proprietary algorithmic trading strategies that were legally classified as corporate trade secrets. In the wrong hands, that document was a weapon of mass financial destruction. If that roster was leaked to our competitors, the hedge fund would instantly lose billions in managed assets. If it was manipulated, it could trigger a catastrophic federal investigation. My career, my spotless professional reputation, and my entire livelihood would be completely obliterated before the opening bell rang on Wall Street. Brandon knew he could not touch my personal wealth anymore, so he had decided to obliterate my ability to generate it. The sharp, piercing ring of my cell phone shattered the tense silence in the office. I did not need to look at the caller identification to know who was waiting on the other end of the line. I picked up the phone, accepting the call, and bringing it to my ear without uttering a single word. "Hello, Claire," Brandon's voice drifted through the speaker, dripping with a sickening, victorious arrogance. "I assume you have noticed the slight modifications to your digital workspace by now. You always were incredibly observant. That was what originally attracted me to you. You have crossed a line that leads directly to federal prison, Brandon." I stated, my voice dangerously flat. "Corporate espionage is not a marital dispute, it is a severe criminal offense." He laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed with pure malice. "Do not bore me with legal lectures. You shredded my power of attorney and humiliated my mother. You took away my money, so I took away your leverage. I am looking at a very interesting spreadsheet right now. It is amazing how much highly sensitive information you keep on a personal laptop. The VIP client roster for a premier Chicago hedge fund. I see senators, tech billionaires, and international conglomerates listed here, along with their heavily guarded trading positions." He paused, letting the magnitude of his theft hang heavily in the air. "I have your client list, Claire. I have already drafted an anonymous email to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I have attached the entire roster along with a beautifully fabricated tip claiming that you have been actively trading on insider information using these clients' capital. It looks incredibly convincing." I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white. "What exactly is your price, Brandon? If you do not write me a check for $50,000 by tonight, I am hitting send. You have until midnight. You pay me or your career is dead." I arranged the meeting at a Stark coffee bar across from my hedge fund building. The glass walls offered no privacy, which was exactly what I required. Brandon wanted to feel like a conquering titan extracting a ransom. I sat at a small corner table watching the rain outside. Brandon walked through the glass doors at noon. The desperate panic from the previous evening had vanished. He resurrected his polished persona wearing a pressed charcoal suit and an arrogant smirk. He moved through the crowded cafe with the unearned swagger of a man who believed he had checkmated a grandmaster. He spotted me, adjusted his silk tie, and slid into the chair opposite mine. "You look exhausted," Claire Brandon stated, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. He leaned back, spreading his arms wide. I told you hoarding your little paycheck would eventually catch up with you. You played an aggressive game, but you fundamentally misunderstood who you were dealing with. You thought you could humiliate my family without facing severe consequences. You thought you were the smartest person in the room. I kept my eyes fixed on my coffee cup, letting my shoulders slump. I needed him to see utter defeat. I needed his massive ego to blind him to the reality of the situation. You crossed a dangerous line, Brandon, I said, keeping my voice quiet and unsteady. Stealing a highly classified client roster from a major hedge fund is not a marital dispute. It is a federal crime. If you send that fabricated email to the Securities and Exchange Commission, you will trigger an investigation that will destroy my entire firm. Brandon chuckled, leaning forward. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. I do not care about your firm, Claire. I care about my capital. I care about restoring the financial order of our marriage. Kendrick came crying to me last night after you humiliated him. He was terrified about his investors demanding an audit. I took control of the situation just like a true leader does. You are going to write me a check for $50,000 right now. I am going to use that money to stabilize my business accounts and throw Kendrick the lifeline he needs to keep his Web3 project afloat. Once our companies are secure, we will revisit the ownership structure of that LLC you created. You will fund our success, and in exchange your client list stays perfectly secure on my hard drive. I forced a deep, wavering sigh. I looked away, letting an expression of desperate resignation wash over my face. I opened my handbag and pulled out a leather checkbook. My hands trembled slightly, a calculated physical response that made Brandon's smirk widen into a predatory grin. If I give you this money, Brandon, I whispered, staring at the blank check, you have to promise me you will permanently delete that file. You cannot hold this over my head forever. My career is everything I have left. He laughed softly, relishing my apparent surrender. You do not get to dictate terms anymore, Claire. You lost. You thought you could outsmart me, but you forgot I have resources you cannot begin to comprehend. Just write the check. Save your little corporate job and let me handle the business. I clicked my pen. I carefully wrote out his name. I filled in the numeric box with exactly $50,000. I spelled out the amount on the payment line, ensuring every single letter was perfectly legible. I signed my name at the bottom, sealing the transaction. I ripped the check from the binding and held it between my fingers, for a fraction of a second perfectly executing the hesitation of a beaten woman. Then I slid the check across the table. Brandon snatched the paper with greedy speed. He examined the signature and the amount, his eyes glowing with unadulterated victory. He folded the check neatly and slipped it into the breast pocket of his expensive suit jacket. He stood up, towering over the small table, thoroughly enjoying his moment of absolute domination. He reached out and mockingly patted me on the shoulder. Good girl, Brandon sneered, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. Leave the finances to the men from now on. You are clearly out of your depth. Without another word, he turned on his heel and confidently strode out of the coffee bar, stepping back out into the cold rain with $50,000 burning a hole in his pocket. I sat perfectly still, watching his dark silhouette disappear down the busy sidewalk. The second he was completely out of sight, the facade of the terrified wife instantly dissolved. I straightened my posture, my breathing slowing to a calm, methodical rhythm. I reached into my handbag and retrieved my personal cell phone. I unlocked the screen and bypassed 2 layers of security to open a hidden folder buried deep within my applications. Brandon believed he had successfully extorted me to save his failing brokerage and Kendrick's fraudulent Ponzi scheme. He believed his cyber attack had cornered me into submission. He was fundamentally wrong on every single conceivable level. The checking account I had drawn those funds from was not a standard personal account. It was a highly monitored honeypot account I had specifically established with the assistance of my hedge fund's internal compliance director. The moment Brandon walked into his bank and deposited that $50,000 check, he would trigger an automatic, irreversible alert. He was not cashing a lifeline. He was cashing a tracked extortion payment that explicitly linked his failing business directly to a severe federal crime. I scrolled through the hidden folder, verifying that the tracking software was active and waiting for the deposit notification. I did not lose the game today. I had simply handed my arrogant, thieving husband the exact murder weapon he needed to completely destroy himself. Brandon did not waste a single moment. My compliance software pinged less than 40 minutes after he walked out of the coffee shop. The notification flashed across my secure monitor, confirming the $50,000 check had been deposited directly into his failing brokerage account. The digital tripwire was officially armed. He had taken the bait with spectacular, predictable greed. Instead of using the funds to quietly untangle his massive legal liabilities or hire a competent defense attorney to mitigate his exposure, Brandon immediately sought the shallow validation of visible wealth. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, he was posting a high-definition video to his private social media story. He was standing inside an exclusive high-end boutique on Oak Street, holding up his left wrist to catch the bright track lighting. A brand new solid gold Rolex gleamed against his skin. The caption read, "Always bet on the winning horse." He had just spent $20,000 of tracked-flagged extortion money on a luxury timepiece solely to convince his elite country club rivals that his financial empire was still completely intact. He desperately needed the heavy gold on his wrist to psychologically ground his crumbling reality. Kendrick was equally reckless, though his specific brand of desperation took a far more pathetic digital form. From my secondary monitor, I watched the blockchain ledger update in real time. Brandon had confidently wired a $15,000 chunk of the extorted funds directly to Kendrick's personal account. Within 10 minutes of the transfer clearing, Kendrick began frantically pumping the freshly stolen cash directly into his proprietary crypto exchange. He was not investing in technological development or securing his vulnerable servers. He was executing immediate targeted payouts to the four loudest, most aggressively litigious investors who had been actively threatening to report his Ponzi scheme to the federal authorities. He sent them their supposed yields, temporarily silencing their furious threats. He even had the sheer audacity to post a screenshot of a forged trading chart on his project forum, arrogantly boasting about a sudden surge in market liquidity. He truly thought he had successfully patched the gaping hole in his sinking ship. In reality, he had just permanently linked his fraudulent enterprise to a documented extortion payout, transforming a civil dispute over bad investments into a massive federal money laundering conspiracy. Not to be outdone by the men in her life, Brenda rapidly consumed the remaining $15,000 to fund her own desperate delusions of grandeur. Her 35th wedding anniversary was rapidly approaching an event she viewed as a royal coronation rather than a simple marital milestone. She had spent months agonizing over the exclusive guest list, desperate to secure the attendance of Chicago's elite families who had recently begun ignoring her phone calls. With Brandon's newly injected capital, she went straight to the most expensive, highly sought-after catering company in the entire city. Her social media updates quickly became an unbearable stream of excessive unearned luxury. She posted a live video of herself tasting imported beluga caviar and demanding specific hand-carved ice sculptures for the main reception hall. She was loudly demanding white glove service and premium champagne fountains, treating the exhausted catering staff like personal indentured servants. She looked directly into the camera lens holding a crystal flute and declared that the Brandon family dynasty was stronger and more prosperous than ever before. She was entirely oblivious to the fatal fact that her premium champagne was paid for by a criminal act that would soon put her beloved son behind steel bars. I sat in my quiet, secure home office watching their digital theatrics unfold across my glowing screens. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or resentment. I felt the cold, analytical satisfaction of an apex predator watching its prey step willingly into a waiting steel trap. This was their fatal flaw. This was the exact psychological vulnerability I had spent my entire career as a risk analyst learning to meticulously identify and ruthlessly exploit. Brandon, Kendrick, and Brenda were so hopelessly addicted to the perception of power that they were completely blind to actual terminal risk. A rational person who had just successfully committed corporate extortion would have buried the money hidden their tracks and lived in a state of quiet paranoia. But the Brandon family simply could not survive in the shadows. Their inflated egos demanded constant public validation. They needed the Rolex, the crypto hype, the caviar, and the applause of their peers just to feel alive. They prioritized social status over basic survival, leaving a massive glowing trail of digital and financial evidence in their wake. They thought my money was a triumphant trophy they had violently wrested from my hands. They did not realize it was a highly toxic tracking die charting every single artery of their corrupt financial network. I closed the social media applications, letting the monitors fade back to my secure terminal interface. The intricate trap was perfectly set, the bait was completely swallowed, and the digital evidence of their extortion and money laundering was flawlessly preserved for the federal authorities. I reached for my porcelain coffee cup, taking a slow sip while savoring the profound silence of my personal workspace. This was the exact moment I had calculated from the beginning. Then a sharp, distinct chime violently broke the quiet of the room. A sleek notification banner slid across the top right corner of my primary screen. It was not a standard alert from my portfolio managers. The rectangular banner was bordered in a harsh flashing crimson red, indicating an urgent priority communication on my heavily encrypted private server. I reached out and clicked the alert icon, authenticating my identity with a biometric thumbprint scan. The encrypted message began to systematically decrypt itself, rendering line by line across the dark screen. The verified sender address at the top of the secure document belonged directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. The stark white text of the decrypted email glared against the black background of my secure terminal. The header proudly displayed the official seal of the Internal Revenue Service, specifically the Criminal Investigation Division. This was not a random correspondence or a standard automated alert. It was the absolute confirmation of a meticulously constructed strategy I had set into motion exactly 90 days ago. I leaned forward in my ergonomic leather chair, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted lines of federal legalese. The message verified receipt of my latest data packet. More importantly, it confirmed the status of my ongoing petition. I had not spent the last 3 years turning a blind eye to Brandon's highly erratic financial behavior. As a senior risk analyst for one of the most ruthless hedge funds in Chicago, identifying anomalies was not just my daily profession. It was simply my very own second nature. 3 months ago, while Brandon was busy playing golf with his elite country club friends and pretending to be a master of the universe, I had quietly audited his personal and business ledgers. The discrepancies were glaring. He was actively running a sophisticated money laundering operation through his failing brokerage firm, artificially inflating client returns to hide massive systemic losses. The moment I discovered the full, terrifying extent of his federal tax fraud, I knew I had to immediately sever my legal liability. I gathered every single piece of digital evidence. I compiled the fraudulent wire transfers, the hidden offshore account numbers, and the fake asset declarations. I packaged them into a pristine, undeniably lethal dossier and submitted it directly to the federal government along with IRS Form 8857. That specific form grants innocent spouse relief. It is meticulously designed to completely shield an innocent partner from severe tax liabilities, heavy penalties, and direct criminal prosecution if they can definitively prove their spouse committed financial fraud without their knowledge or active participation. I had already provided the federal government with the smoking gun exactly 3 months ago. Today, I simply handed them the final bullets. When Brandon sat across from me in that glass-walled coffee shop and aggressively demanded $50,000 to permanently save his crumbling empire, he genuinely believed he was dominating the entire interaction. He truly thought he was extorting a terrified, submissive wife. He did not bother to look closely at the physical check I slid across the wooden table. If he had paused his arrogant gloating for just one solitary second, he would have explicitly noticed two critical details. First, the check was not drawn from our joint marital account or my personal savings. It was drawn directly from a registered corporate account tied to my anonymous limited liability company, the exact same corporate entity that legally owned the vast estate he was currently standing in. Second, I had clearly written four specific words on the front memo line: Business Capital Repayment Loan. By forcefully demanding me to write that specific check under the explicit threat of severe corporate sabotage, Brandon had legally accepted a documented business loan meant strictly for commercial stabilization. The absolute moment he endorsed the back of that check and handed it to his bank teller, he entered into a highly binding financial contract under strict federal law. The funds were legally earmarked for business capitalization and absolutely nothing else. But Brandon, driven entirely by his insatiable, pathetic need for constant social validation, immediately diverted those commercial funds into personal luxury items. He selfishly spent $20,000 on a solid gold Rolex. He then wired $15,000 to Kendrick's fraudulent crypto scheme to instantly silence their angry investors. Brenda aggressively blew the remaining $15,000 on beluga caviar and imported champagne for a meaningless anniversary gala. They did not just waste my money today, they committed blatant, highly irrefutable corporate embezzlement on a massive scale. The tracking software directly tied to my honeypot account had already compiled the exact digital timestamps, merchant identification codes, and wire routing numbers for every single one of their utterly reckless purchases. I exported the complete digital transaction log and seamlessly attached it to my ongoing federal case file. Brandon had just unknowingly provided the Internal Revenue Service with real-time, indisputable mathematical proof of tax evasion, extensive wire fraud, and the gross misappropriation of corporate funds. He had brazenly documented his very own felony on his public social media profiles. The sheer, overwhelming stupidity of his thoughtless actions was almost breathtaking to behold. He had essentially weaponized his own fragile ego against himself, acting as the primary undisputed star witness for his own impending federal prosecution. The severe consequences of this specific sequence of events were absolutely terminal. The federal authorities did not require any further drawn-out investigation or prolonged legal discovery. They already had the initial dossier completely proving systemic tax fraud, and they now possessed the real-time transactional data proving active money laundering and corporate embezzlement. Brandon arrogantly thought he could seamlessly use my VIP client roster to utterly destroy my hard-earned career. He completely failed to realize that the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service share powerful investigative resources when dealing with high-level financial crimes. By foolishly threatening to criminally report me, he had actually accelerated the government's timeline regarding his own impending destruction. I watched the decryption progress bar hit 100%. The final paragraph of the email materialized on my screen, glowing with a crisp, undeniable finality. The lead federal investigator assigned to my case was officially confirming the immediate status of my Form 8857 petition. The message was concise, devoid of any emotional sentiment, and devastatingly effective. My request for innocent spouse relief was granted permanently, shielding my assets, my career, and my personal freedom from the coming storm. The email explicitly stated that the transactional evidence I provided today was sufficient to trigger an immediate unannounced federal intervention. The IRS audit is approved and finalized. The crisp, undeniable finality of the IRS notification glowed on my screen. Brandon was effectively neutralized, utterly oblivious to the federal anvil suspended inches above his head. He would spend the next week parading his new Rolex around the country club, completely unaware that his accounts were being systematically frozen and his business records subpoenaed. I allowed myself a single deep breath of satisfaction before archiving the IRS correspondence into my encrypted vault. Brandon was a problem already solved. It was time to pivot. I closed his file and opened a fresh, sterile workspace on my secondary monitor. Kendrick was next. Brandon's younger brother possessed all of the family arrogance, but absolutely none of the superficial charm that allowed Brandon to occasionally fail upward. Kendrick fancied himself a technological visionary, a brilliant pioneer in the decentralized finance sector. In reality, he was a lazy grifter running a digital shell game. His entire Web3 enterprise, a cryptocurrency token he obnoxiously named Apex Coin, was nothing more than a poorly coded imitation of existing platforms. He used flashy marketing jargon and aggressive social media campaigns to lure in amateur investors, promising them astronomical returns on their initial capital. As a senior risk analyst, I spent my days dissecting complex derivative markets and identifying subtle systemic vulnerabilities in multinational corporations. Tracing a localized crypto scam run by an arrogant amateur was barely an intellectual warm-up. I bypassed his rudimentary firewall with a few keystrokes and accessed the public blockchain ledger. The beauty of cryptocurrency, a fact Kendrick fundamentally misunderstood, is that while identities can be masked, the actual transactions are permanently recorded and entirely transparent to anyone who knows exactly where to look. I initiated a custom tracking algorithm I had developed for my hedge fund, setting it to map the movement of every single Apex coin from its inception. The visual representation materialized on my screen as a sprawling interconnected web of digital wallets. Within 10 minutes, the undeniable pattern of a classic pump and dump scheme revealed itself in glaring detail. Kendrick had generated millions of tokens out of thin air and hoarded 80% of them in dozens of anonymous wallets he secretly controlled. He then aggressively marketed the remaining 20% to his gullible investors. When the artificial scarcity and relentless social media hype drove the price upward, he would quietly sell off massive chunks of his hidden reserve, pocketing the actual cash and deliberately crashing the token value for everyone else. It was an incredibly simple, incredibly illegal maneuver. Instead, he was directly distributing money laundered through a federal tax evasion conspiracy. I began compiling the evidence. I took high-resolution captures of the blockchain ledger, drawing clear, undeniable red lines connecting Kendrick's primary developer wallet to the supposedly anonymous accounts executing the market dumps. I downloaded the source code of his token, highlighting the specific backdoors he had programmed to allow himself unlimited administrative access to investor funds. I paired this technical data with screenshots of his public statements promising guaranteed returns, establishing clear intent to deceive. The dossier I assembled was a masterpiece of financial forensics. It was 50 pages of irrefutable mathematically proven fraud. It detailed exactly how much money had been stolen, where it was currently hidden, and the precise mechanics Kendrick used to manipulate the market. It was a comprehensive roadmap to a wire fraud conviction. The next step required surgical precision. Releasing this dossier to the general public would cause a panic, but it might give Kendrick enough time to destroy his hard drives and flee. I needed a targeted strike. I needed the people who had the resources, the anger, and the legal motivation to tear his life apart before he even realized what was happening. I focused on the 4 investors Kendrick had just paid off. These were not casual hobbyists. I ran their wallet addresses through proprietary databases and identified them. They were a consortium of aggressive, highly litigious real estate developers from Miami who had foolishly decided to dabble in cryptocurrency. They were men who sued their own business partners over minor contract disputes. They possessed the exact temperament required for my plan. They had accepted Kendrick's temporary payout, but their initial suspicion proved they were already looking for a reason to destroy him. I created a secure, untraceable email address routed through 3 international proxy servers. I drafted a brief, entirely clinical message outlining the contents of the attached dossier. I did not use threats or emotional language. I simply presented the data as an anonymous security researcher exposing a critical market vulnerability. I attached the 50-page PDF, verified the encryption protocols, and hit send. The data packet silently departed my server, racing through underwater cables to land directly in the inboxes of the four most dangerous men Kendrick had ever attempted to scam. I leaned back and watched my blockchain monitor. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the digital landscape began to violently shift. The Miami consortium did not just read the dossier, they weaponized it. They immediately initiated emergency withdrawals, attempting to pull their remaining capital from the Apex coin exchange. When Kendrick's automated system predictably blocked their massive withdrawal requests due to lack of actual liquidity, the fallout was instantaneous. They did not post angry messages on social media. They did not call Kendrick to demand an explanation. They bypassed the digital realm entirely and went straight to the authorities. My screen flashed as I intercepted the public filing notifications. Within a single hour of receiving my dossier, the investors' attorneys were submitting emergency injunctions to the federal courts. But more importantly, the local authorities were being mobilized. Kendrick had used interstate digital networks to intentionally defraud investors of their capital. The formal police reports were currently being processed, officially documenting multiple severe counts of federal wire fraud. Kendrick was currently sitting in his expensive penthouse apartment, foolishly celebrating his false victory today. He believed he had outsmarted everyone. He did not know that his digital fortress had already been breached and completely dismantled. The federal authorities were preparing to execute a coordinated raid on his property. His impending criminal arrest was now completely inevitable. The arrogant crypto visionary was about to lose absolutely everything he valued in this entire world today. The digital wheels of justice moved with silent speed. While Brandon slept soundly in his luxury condominium, oblivious to his impending IRS destruction, the authorities in Miami had coordinated with Chicago law enforcement. Kendrick's crypto scam had triggered a rapid federal response. The federal wire fraud complaints generated immediate warrants. The influx of extorted money into a known fraudulent exchange was the exact catalyst the prosecutors needed to bypass bureaucratic delays. Kendrick had provided them with a perfect target. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the quiet serenity of Brenda's suburban neighborhood was interrupted. Rain continued to fall. Red and blue police lights sliced through the darkness, reflecting off Brenda's hedges and iron gates. 3 cruisers pulled into her driveway. The officers did not use their sirens, but the strobing lights were impossible to ignore. 3 officers marched up to the front doors and began pounding with heavy fists. Brenda woke instantly. She threw off her duvet, furious that someone dared to disturb her the night before her anniversary gala. She marched toward the window, ready to call the security patrol to handle the trespassers. The moment she looked down and saw the flashing police lights illuminating her lawn, her fury morphed into terror. Her first thought was not about the safety of her husband or her children. Her immediate concern was the neighbors. The Harrisons lived across the street. The Montgomery family lived next door. They were all on the guest list for tomorrow night's gala. If they looked out their windows and saw police cruisers parked on the Brandon estate, her social standing would evaporate overnight. She rushed down the grand staircase, tying her silk robe around her waist. She unlocked the front door, pulling it open just a fraction to prevent the flashing lights from illuminating her grand foyer. She demanded that the officers turn off their vehicle lights, citing the late hour and the homeowner association rules. The detective ignored her demands. He held up a badge and a paper stating they had a federal warrant for the arrest of Kendrick Brandon on wire fraud and money laundering. Brenda staggered backward. Before she could formulate a lie to protect her son, Kendrick appeared at the top of the staircase. He was wearing pajamas, clutching his phone and looking down at the police officers with terrified eyes. The officers did not hesitate. They pushed past Brenda, marching up the stairs and grabbing Kendrick. They spun him around, pressing him against the wallpaper while they slapped handcuffs onto his wrists. Kendrick began to sob, his bravado vanishing the second the metal snapped shut. He whined that it was a mistake, that the blockchain data was wrong, that he was an innovator. The detective read him his Miranda rights, unimpressed by his delusions. Brenda followed them out into the pouring rain, ignoring that her silk robe was getting ruined. She was hyperventilating, demanding the officers release her son. When they placed him into the back of the cruiser, she realized she had to act fast to contain the social damage. She rushed back inside, grabbed her purse, and drove her luxury black sedan to the downtown precinct. The reality of the situation was far worse than she could have imagined. The bail amount was set at a high figure due to the federal flight risk associated with cryptocurrency fraud. Brenda was forced to sit in a plastic chair in a waiting room for 4 agonizing hours. She maxed out her 3 credit cards just to secure the services of a bail bondsman. By the time Kendrick was temporarily released into her custody just after 6 in the morning, her financial reserves were decimated. The moment they stepped out of the police precinct and into the crisp air, the Brandon family dynamic fractured. Brenda did not hug her terrified son. She rounded on him with raw fury. She screamed that he was a disgrace, a pathetic failure who had ruined her perfect weekend. She poked him in the chest, demanding to know how he could be so stupid as to get arrested hours before her 35th anniversary gala. She reminded him that she had just spent her last dollar bailing him out of a holding cell. Kendrick screamed right back at her, the stress breaking his mind. He yelled that he only used the money Brandon gave him. He blamed his older brother, shouting that Brandon was the one who provided the funds that triggered the federal tracking algorithms. He called his mother a woman who cared more about serving caviar to friends than she cared about her own son's impending federal prison sentence. They stood in the parking lot, tearing each other apart, unaware that their financial empire was already dead. The morning sun slowly rose over the city, signaling the official start of the anniversary gala day. I was sitting comfortably at my kitchen island, sipping a fresh cup of hot black coffee. The house was wonderfully quiet. I checked my encrypted monitor one final time, verifying that Kendrick's arrest had been officially processed into the federal database. The trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. My personal cell phone buzzed on the granite countertop. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message from Brandon. He was awake, feeling invincible after his successful extortion and completely ready to dominate the social event of the season. His message was brief, demanding, and dripping with his usual arrogant condescension. "Put on a nice dress and act like a good wife tomorrow. Do not embarrass me." I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter. I picked up the phone, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard with calm, methodical intent. I thought about the federal agents currently building their case. I thought about Brenda maxing out her credit cards in a police precinct. I thought about the devastation that was about to rain down upon their family. I hit send. I would not miss it for the world. The massive crystal chandeliers of the Oak Brook Country Club cast a warm golden glow over the grand ballroom, illuminating a scene of profound manufactured excess. Brenda had spared absolutely no expense for her 35th wedding anniversary. Towering floral arrangements of imported white orchids dominated every single table. Uniformed waiters circulated seamlessly through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with the exact beluga caviar and vintage champagne she had secured using stolen funds just 24 hours earlier. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to an evening built entirely on a foundation of massive federal fraud. Brenda stood near the ice sculpture centerpiece, wearing a custom-tailored emerald gown and a staggering amount of diamond jewelry. Despite the chaotic, traumatizing events at the downtown police precinct earlier that morning, she had resurrected her flawless socialite persona with terrifying speed. She held a crystal champagne flute surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy, influential women she desperately wanted to impress. Her voice carried over the ambient noise of the ballroom, deliberately loud enough for neighboring groups to hear her blatant fabrications. She laughed, a bright, artificial sound, waving her diamond-clad hand. "Brandon is just doing phenomenally well," she boasted to Mrs. Harrison, the club president. His brokerage firm just closed another massive quarter. He is such a wealthy, providing son. And Kendrick, well, Kendrick. He is a true innovative entrepreneur. His digital platforms are revolutionizing the financial sector. He is so busy with his developers that he barely had time to make it tonight. She took a delicate sip of champagne, completely ignoring the reality that her innovative entrepreneur son was currently sweating through his tailored suit out on a heavily leveraged bail bond, and utterly terrified of the ankle monitor currently chafing his leg. Beneath his expensive trousers, Kendrick stood by the private bar across the room, downing scotch and frantically checking his phone every 30 seconds, waiting for his lawyers to call with an update on his impending federal indictment. I stepped through the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom. I did not sneak in quietly, and I certainly did not wear the conservative, understated navy dress Brandon had explicitly laid out for me. That morning, I wore a striking, floor-length crimson gown that demanded absolute attention. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, and my expression carried the cold, unyielding confidence of a woman who held the execution switch to their entire dynasty. I did not look like a submissive, defeated wife who had just surrendered $50,000 to a bullying husband. I looked like an apex predator stepping into a cage full of oblivious soft targets. The sudden shift in the room's dynamic was immediate. Conversations naturally paused as guests turned their heads to look at the entrance. A few wives from the country club committee whispered to each other behind their hands. Clearly surprised by my sudden transformation, I walked slowly across the polished hardwood floor, my heels clicking with rhythmic, methodical precision. Every step I took was a calculated display of absolute power. I was not hiding in the shadows anymore. I was claiming the spotlight they had so desperately tried to steal. Brandon spotted me before I even reached the center of the room. His arrogant smile instantly vanished, replaced by a dark, furious scowl. He hastily excused himself from a group of golf buddies and marched directly toward me, cutting through the crowd with aggressive, heavy strides. He was wearing his brand new, illicitly purchased gold Rolex, the heavy timepiece flashing under the chandelier light. He desperately wanted to project the image of a commanding patriarch, but I could clearly see the tiny beads of nervous sweat forming along his hairline. The stress of managing his collapsing financial house of cards was finally beginning to show through the cracks of his polished facade. He intercepted me near the champagne tower, stepping directly into my path to physically block my forward momentum. He reached out and forcefully clamped his hand around my upper arm. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into my skin in a clear physical demand for immediate submission. He pulled me slightly closer, leaning down so his mouth was just inches from my ear. "What the hell are you wearing?" Brandon hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper that only I could hear. "I told you to put on the navy dress. You are drawing way too much attention. Smile for the cameras and act like a good wife tonight. Do not embarrass me in front of these people." I looked down at the heavy gold watch resting on his wrist, the exact item that would serve as Exhibit A in his upcoming federal prosecution for corporate embezzlement. Then I slowly raised my eyes to meet his furious gaze. I did not flinch. I did not apologize. I did not offer a meek, terrified excuse. I looked at him with an expression of profound, chilling emptiness. I felt the absolute certainty of my impending victory surging through my veins. The trap was fully operational. The authorities were actively moving, and the entire Brandon family was completely out of time. They had spent years treating me like a disposable asset, a minor obstacle to be bullied and managed. They had fundamentally underestimated my intelligence, my resolve, and my capacity for total systematic destruction. I smoothly pulled my arm out of his aggressive grasp, applying just enough sudden force to break his hold without causing a visible scene. I smoothed the fabric of my crimson gown, giving him a brilliant, razor-sharp smile that did not reach my eyes. I turned my back on my husband, leaving him standing speechless by the champagne tower. I squared my shoulders and began walking directly toward the grand stage at the far end of the room, where the main microphone was already set up for the evening toasts. I stepped up to the grand stage, my heels echoing a final resonant strike against the polished mahogany stairs. The microphone stood waiting on a silver stand bathed in the soft, focused beam of a solitary spotlight. I adjusted the height with smooth, unhurried precision. I raised my hand and tapped the microphone twice. The sharp amplified thuds cut through the murmurs of the Oakbrook Country Club elite. The ambient chatter of 300 high society guests evaporated into total silence. The string quartet lowered their bows. Every face in the grand ballroom turned toward me, their expressions a mixture of polite curiosity and mild surprise. I scanned the crowd, my gaze sweeping over the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos before landing squarely on the Brandon family table. Brenda sat at the center of it all, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. She adjusted her diamond necklace, her chin tilted upward in an arrogant posture of expected triumph. She looked genuinely proud. In her delusional reality, my presence on this stage was the ultimate surrender. She fully anticipated a tearful, submissive tribute, a public declaration of gratitude for allowing me to exist within their prestigious orbit. She thought I was validating her entire existence. "Good evening." I began, my voice projecting crystal clear across the silent ballroom. It was steady, commanding, and completely devoid of the trembling hesitation Brandon had always demanded from me. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate 35 years of the Brandon family legacy. It is a legacy built on a very specific, unwavering philosophy." I paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to hang on my next word. I locked eyes with my husband. He was standing exactly where I left him by the champagne tower, his face flushed red, his jaw clenched tightly. My husband Brandon possesses a remarkably brilliant and straightforward philosophy regarding family and obligation. I continued pacing slowly across the stage, owning every inch of the platform. A few years ago, when I faced a devastating personal crisis and asked for his support, he offered me a piece of wisdom that fundamentally changed the trajectory of my entire life. He looked me directly in the eyes and told me, "Your parents are your problem. My money is mine. Responsibility belongs to the individual." A soft, uncomfortable ripple of whispers washed over the front tables. The Harrisons exchanged a bewildered glance. The Montgomerys shifted in their seats. This was not the standard polite country club toast. This was a direct surgical laceration of the guest of honor delivered with a smile. I saw the exact moment Brenda's smug anticipation shattered. Her posture stiffened, her hands dropping awkwardly to her lap. She shot a frantic, venomous glare toward Brandon, demanding he intervene, but he was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer, unprecedented audacity of my public defiance. At the time, I did not fully understand the profound depth of his words. I projected my voice, rising slightly to command absolute attention. I foolishly believed that marriage and family required partnership, sacrifice, and mutual protection. I believed that when you held resources, you used them to elevate the people you claim to love. But Brandon taught me a vital lesson about this family. He taught me that loyalty is transactional, that vulnerability is a weakness to be exploited, and that true power comes from relentless, unapologetic individualism. I turned my attention from Brandon to his mother. Brenda was gripping the edge of her table, the heavy emerald silk of her gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. "Brenda has always been the primary architect of this magnificent legacy," I stated, gesturing elegantly toward the towering white orchids. "She has dedicated her entire existence to projecting an image of flawless prosperity. She demands excellence. She demands the absolute best that money can buy. And she demands that the world recognizes her unyielding superiority." My gaze slid to the private bar. Kendrick was still standing there, gripping his scotch glass so hard his knuckles were white. His arrogant facade had completely crumbled, replaced by the twitchy, desperate terror of a man who knew the federal authorities were already circling his penthouse. "And then we have Kendrick." I noted, my tone laced with a razor-sharp edge of mock admiration. "The family's resident technological pioneer. A man who relies entirely on his own unique brand of innovation to fund his lifestyle. He takes what he wants." I stepped back to the center of the microphone stand. The tension in the grand ballroom was absolute. 300 prominent citizens were holding their breath, captivated by the slow-motion implosion of the Brandon dynasty. "Responsibility belongs to the individual." I repeated, letting Brandon's cruel words echo off the vaulted ceiling. For years, I let this family dictate my worth. I allowed myself to be managed, belittled, and treated as a disposable asset. I absorbed the financial sabotage and the blatant disrespect because I thought it was my duty to keep the peace. I smiled, a cold, lethal expression that made Brandon physically take a step backward. Today I want to honor his brilliant philosophy. I announced, my voice ringing with undeniable finality. I want to honor the standard established by Brenda, the innovation executed by Kendrick, and the absolute selfishness perfected by Brandon. Tonight, I am stepping out of their shadow, and I am giving this family exactly what they have earned. I did not raise a glass. I did not ask the crowd to join me in a toast. Instead, I raised my left hand and snapped my fingers twice. The synchronized movement was instantaneous. 3 waiters dressed in immaculate black tuxedos immediately broke away from the kitchen entrance. They moved directly toward their designated targets. The first waiter stopped in front of a horrified Brenda. The second waiter approached Kendrick at the bar. The third stepped directly in front of Brandon. Instead of champagne, they handed 3 thick red envelopes to Brandon, Brenda, and Kendrick. Brandon stared at the thick red envelope resting on the silver tray presented to him. For a fraction of a second, his arrogant facade faltered, replaced by genuine, unadulterated confusion. He looked from the perfectly silent waiter up to me, standing on the illuminated stage. The heavy silence in the ballroom magnified the crisp sound of heavy cardstock being torn open. Brandon ripped the seal of his envelope with aggressive, jerky movements, his face flushed with a dangerous cocktail of embarrassment and rising fury. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy brass clip. He flipped open the cover page. I watched from the stage as the blood physically drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray under the crystal chandeliers. The top document bore the unmistakable, intimidating seal of the Internal Revenue Service. It was an expedited, finalized notice of a comprehensive federal audit, accompanied by a staggering penalty assessment. I brought the microphone slightly closer to my mouth, ensuring every single syllable echoed through the cavernous ballroom with absolute clarity. "Brandon," I said, my voice completely devoid of warmth, "you demanded $50,000 from me yesterday morning in a coffee shop. You threatened to destroy my professional reputation if I did not instantly comply with your extortion. You believed you were asserting your dominance. You failed to realize you were stepping into a meticulously designed federal trap." The entire country club sat paralyzed. 300 wealthy guests held their collective breath, their eyes darting between my commanding presence on the stage and Brandon's rapidly collapsing posture on the floor. Brenda clutched her own unopened red envelope against her chest, her emerald gown suddenly looking like a prison uniform. Kendrick stood frozen by the bar, sweating profusely, too terrified to even glance down at the envelope resting in his shaking hands. "That $50,000 check was not drawn from a personal account," I announced, letting the words strike him like physical blows. "It was drafted directly from my corporate entity, explicitly designated as a commercial stabilization loan. The absolute moment you endorsed that document, you entered into a binding federal contract. And what did you do with those commercial funds? You spent $20,000 on a solid gold Rolex, the very same watch currently strapped to your wrist." Several guests at the nearby tables audibly gasped physically, leaning away from Brandon, as if his sudden legal toxicity were contagious. The country club president, Mrs. Harrison, placed a hand over her mouth in absolute shock. "The $50,000 you extorted from me was digitally tracked from the second it left my account," I continued, my tone surgically precise. "Using commercial funds for a personal luxury asset just sealed your federal tax fraud case. The IRS already possessed the dossier I submitted 3 months ago, detailing your systemic money laundering. Your reckless purchase yesterday simply provided them with the final, indisputable proof of active corporate embezzlement. The Internal Revenue Service is penalizing you $200,000. Brandon opened his mouth, but no sound emerged from his throat. He looked down at the heavy Rolex, his hand trembling so violently the expensive gold links rattled sharply against each other. He was entirely trapped. There was absolutely no viable exit strategy available to him today. No clever lie he could construct to escape the massive federal consequences of his deeply arrogant actions. They are freezing your business accounts, seizing your brokerage assets, and preparing criminal indictments. I stated the amplification, carrying my verdict to the back of the room. You thought you could use my money to patch the holes in your sinking ship. Instead, you handed the federal government the exact ammunition they needed to sink you permanently. He flipped frantically to the second document in the stack, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. I did not give him a single second to recover. I maintained my relentless offensive. The second document you are holding is a finalized petition for innocent spouse relief, heavily corroborated by the federal investigators handling your case. I explained, maintaining intense eye contact with him. It legally severs me from every single piece of your financial fallout. It proves with absolute mathematical certainty that your fraudulent activities were conducted entirely without my knowledge or participation. My assets, my career, and my personal freedom are completely shielded from your impending destruction. I watched him flip to the final document. The stark, undeniable reality of his situation was finally penetrating his thick skull. His chest heaved as he stared at the crisp, black ink. "Those are divorce papers," I declared, my voice ringing with undeniable finality. "Signed, notarized, and legally filed. I have spent the last 3 years quietly restructuring my wealth and legally isolating myself from your reckless behavior. We have absolutely no joint assets remaining. Your debts, your federal penalties, and your impending legal fees are 100% yours. You wanted responsibility to belong to the individual Brandon. You got exactly what you asked for. Enjoy." Brandon dropped the heavy stack of papers. They hit the polished hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud that echoed in the silent ballroom. His face, completely drained of all color moments ago, suddenly flushed with a dark, violent shade of crimson. The sheer humiliation of being systematically dismantled in front of the most powerful people in Oakbrook shattered whatever fragile restraint he had left. He let out a feral, inarticulate shout of pure rage. He lunged forward, his hands curling into tight fists, his entire body coiled to charge the stage and attack me. He took exactly one aggressive step before a wall of solid muscle intercepted him. Two massive country club security guards, men I had generously tipped and treated with profound respect for years, stepped directly into his path. They did not hesitate. They quickly grabbed Brandon by his expensive suit jacket, forcefully hauling him backward and pinning his arms to his sides. With Brandon securely neutralized by the country club guards, the collective attention of the grand ballroom snapped directly toward the private bar. Kendrick stood frozen, his eyes darting frantically between his struggling brother and the thick red envelope resting heavily in his own trembling hands. He had always been the slicker sibling, the smooth-talking digital entrepreneur who operated entirely behind a veil of complex technological jargon and manufactured hype. But in this exact moment, stripped of his expensive marketing facade, he looked like a terrified child. His hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped the envelope before finally managing to rip the seal. He pulled out a crisp, heavy sheet of government stationery. The official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Cybercrimes Division gleamed under the ambient light. Kendrick stared at the black text, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The crystal Scotch glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the polished brass footrail of the bar and shattering into dozens of glittering pieces. The sharp noise caused his wife Stephanie to flinch violently. Stephanie had spent the entire evening bragging to the country club wives about Kendrick's latest round of venture capital funding. She snatched the heavy paper directly from his limp fingers. Her eyes scanned the federal notification rapidly. The document outlined a comprehensive immediate freeze on every single one of their domestic and offshore financial assets, citing multiple impending federal indictments for egregious wire fraud and the systematic operation of an illicit digital Ponzi scheme. The color drained entirely from Stephanie's impeccably made-up face. She looked at the man she had married for his supposedly limitless wealth and saw nothing but a broke, impending federal convict. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed off the vaulted ceiling, striking Kendrick hard on the shoulder with her diamond-clad hand. I leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring my voice carried over Stephanie's escalating public meltdown. It appears our resident innovative entrepreneur is experiencing a slight disruption in his cash flow. I announced, my tone conversational yet brutally loud. Kendrick has spent the last 4 years actively recruiting investors from this very room, selling you all on a revolutionary financial platform that simply did not exist. He routed your hard-earned investments through dummy corporations to exclusively fund his luxury cars, his penthouse, and his wife's extensive designer wardrobe. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has been meticulously tracking those specific wire transfers for 14 long months. As of this exact moment, Kendrick possesses absolutely zero access to any capital whatsoever. His bank accounts are frozen solid, his digital wallets are legally seized, and his luxury vehicles are currently being towed from the valet parking lot outside. The brilliant financial disruptor of the Brandon family is entirely bankrupt and facing 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Stephanie shrieked again, hurling her expensive champagne flute at Kendrick's chest before turning and sprinting frantically out of the grand ballroom, desperately trying to distance herself from the catastrophic social and legal fallout. Kendrick collapsed against the heavy mahogany bar, burying his face in his hands, completely unable to meet the furious, betrayed glares of the wealthy investors surrounding him. The dynasty had fallen, leaving only the matriarch standing in the ruins. I turned my focused attention back to the center table. Brenda remained absolutely motionless, staring at her unopened red envelope as if it contained a live explosive. Her carefully constructed universe of social superiority and manufactured elegance was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. She slowly picked up the envelope, her manicured fingers trembling so severely she could barely manage to tear the heavy paper flap. She reached inside and pulled out a single, heavily embossed document. It was not a federal indictment or a divorce decree. It was a formal, extremely past-due collection notice issued directly by the Oak Brook Country Club Board of Directors. Brenda stared at the staggering total printed at the bottom of the page, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. I tapped the microphone one final time, letting the sharp sound command the entire room. "Brenda!" I projected, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick, suffocating tension. "For over a decade, you have paraded around this prestigious club, treating the dedicated staff like indentured servants and looking down your nose at anyone who did not meet your impossible, hypocritical standards of wealth. You demanded this lavish, exorbitant anniversary party tonight to solidly reaffirm your status as the reigning queen of Oak Brook High Society. But there is a minor administrative detail you seem to have completely overlooked while planning your grand celebration. Your elite club membership, the absolute cornerstone of your entire social identity, was paid for exclusively by me." I paused momentarily, letting the collective gasp of the country club wives wash over the silent room. "And I canceled that membership exactly 15 days ago." I continued, delivering the final fatal strike. "You currently owe the Oak Brook Country Club Board of Directors $15,000 for the premium catering, the string quartet, and the imported white orchids surrounding you tonight. Since you clearly do not possess the personal funds to cover your manufactured excess, I strongly suggest you ask your incredibly wealthy providing son to foot the bill." The wealthy guests surrounding the Brandon table immediately began murmuring in profound disgust. The carefully maintained illusion of their untouchable family superiority was completely shattered. Lifelong friends physically turned their chairs away, refusing to even look at the disgraced matriarch. Brenda looked desperately around the grand room, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic as she realized her entire prestigious social circle was actively abandoning her. The crushing weight of the absolute humiliation finally overwhelmed her fragile system. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed backward, fainting dead away onto the cold, polished hardwood ballroom floor, her heavy emerald silk gown pooling all around her in a pitiful heap of total, complete defeat. Brenda's heavy emerald gown pooled around her unconscious form, but not a single guest stepped forward to offer assistance. The elite guests simply stared in horrified fascination, stepping backward to distance themselves from the collapse. The grand ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. The string quartet had fled, leaving only the harsh acoustics of a family being dismantled. Across the room, Stephanie's hysterical shrieks pierced the air as she physically attacked Kendrick, her fists pounding against his tuxedo. She screamed about her ruined reputation and seized accounts. Kendrick did not even try to defend himself. He cowered against the mahogany bar, shielding his face while searching for an exit. The FBI notification lay trampled beneath their feet, a testament to his shattered empire. I stood still on the stage watching the destruction I had meticulously orchestrated. I felt no pity, no remorse. I felt only absolute vindication. Every insult and financial manipulation had been repaid in full. A sudden movement drew my attention back to the center of the room. Brandon had stopped fighting the country club security guards. The aggressive, domineering patriarch who had threatened to destroy my professional reputation mere hours ago had completely vanished. In his place stood a broken, terrified man, realizing he was staring down the barrel of federal prison and total financial ruin. The security guards released his arms, stepping back with expressions of deep disgust. Brandon stumbled forward, his legs trembling so severely he could barely support his own weight. He moved toward the edge of the stage, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He did not yell out. He did not threaten. Instead, he did something I had never in our entire decade of marriage witnessed him do. He dropped straight down onto his knees. The heavy thud of his knees hitting the polished hardwood floor silenced the immediate vicinity. Even Stephanie paused her frantic screaming to stare at her brother-in-law. Brandon looked up at me, his face slick with nervous sweat, his hands clasped together in a pathetic gesture of absolute desperation. "Claire, please," Brandon begged, his voice cracking, completely stripped of its usual arrogant resonance. "You have to stop this. You have to call the IRS investigators. Tell them that it was a misunderstanding. Tell them the $50,000 was a gift. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you need. Just call off the federal agents. Please." I looked down at the man I had once vowed to spend my life with. I searched my heart for even a microscopic fragment of sympathy, a lingering shred of the love I had once foolishly offered him. There was nothing there but cold, impenetrable ice. "We are family." Brandon sobbed, tears actually welling in his eyes, as the reality of his $200,000 penalty and impending criminal indictment crushed his spirit. "You cannot do this to your own family. We can fix this. Please, Claire, have some mercy." I slowly descended the 3 wooden stairs from the grand stage, my crimson gown sweeping elegantly behind me. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of where he kneeled. I looked down at his pathetic, sniveling form, committing this exact image to memory. This was the man who had demanded my submission, who had treated my success as a threat, and who had viewed my wealth as his personal emergency fund. "You demanded $50,000 from me to buy a solid gold Rolex, while your company was actively imploding." I stated, my voice low, sharp, and perfectly steady. "You forged financial documents, you embezzled corporate funds, and you routinely humiliated me to inflate your own fragile ego. You made your choices, Brandon, with absolute arrogance and zero regard for anyone else." "Mais, see, I leaned in slightly, ensuring he could see the total unyielding emptiness in my eyes. "Your parents are your problem," I whispered, feeding his own cruel, selfish philosophy directly back to him. "My money is mine. Your federal tax fraud, your impending bankruptcy, and your upcoming divorce are your problems. Responsibility belongs to the individual. Enjoy the consequences of your independence." I did not wait for a response. The sea of wealthy guests instantly parted for me, stepping aside with a mixture of profound shock and undeniable respect. No one spoke. No one tried to stop me. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. The silence of the parking lot was a stark contrast to the screaming match echoing from inside the club. I walked toward my car, the rhythmic clicking of my heels sounding like a victory march. As I unlocked the door, my phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Thomas and Diane, the elderly couple who had practically raised me when my own parents passed away, the people I truly considered family. The message was short and beautiful. The surgery went perfectly. Thank you for funding the specialist, sweetheart. We love you so much. A genuine warm smile spread across my face. That was where my wealth belonged. That was what true family looked like. I slid into the driver's seat, pulling the heavy door shut. I looked down at the diamond wedding ring still resting on my left hand. It was a symbol of a prison I had finally escaped. I rolled down my window, pulled the diamond ring from my finger, and casually dropped it straight down the metal grate of the storm drain. I put the car in drive and accelerated down the private road, heading straight toward the bright glowing lights of the city. I was rich, I was entirely free, and I was utterly victorious.